His father pulled the wagon tire from the coals and set it on the dirt floor of the forge. The iron was orange at the center, fading to dull red at the rim, and the heat coming off it pressed against the boy's face like a hand held too close. His father said one word: remember. Later, after the fire had died, his father set two pieces of metal in the snow, one thin, one heavy, and held the boy's hand above each without touching. The thin one was cold. The heavy one still pushed warmth against his palm. That was 38 years ago. Now the boy was a man with a stiff shoulder and a cabin that would freeze before dawn, and the law said he could not keep enough wood to stop it. The settlement of Saints Rest sat above California Gulch like a scar on the mountainside, 12 miles from Leadville and 1,000 feet closer to the sky. Asa Varden had lived there for 2 years, which was long enough to know the sound a stove made when it was dying, and the silence that followed when a man had nothing left to feed it. He was 46 years old. His left shoulder had been stiff since a trapline accident on the Gunnison 8 winters before, and the cold made it worse. He had spent 20 years moving through high country, trapping, skinning mules, guiding freight wagons through passes that killed the careless and the unlucky in equal measure. He had come to Saints Rest because the silver boom promised wages. What it delivered was a 12 by 16-foot cabin built into a shallow slope, one plank wall still poorly chinked, 2 cracked windows stuffed with rags, and a cast iron stove that ate wood faster than Asa could cut it. The year was 1880. By late October, the aspens had already gone bare, and the first hard frost cracked the mud between the cabin logs. Asa counted what he had the way a man counts coins when the bill is already due. 3 days of flour, 9 pounds of beans, a quarter sack of salt, less than half a cord of dry pine stacked against the south wall, and winter had not yet begun. Under normal conditions, he would need 6 cords to survive until April. He had calculated that number on a split board with a charcoal stub, marking days against burn rate the way his father had once marked wagon loads against road distance. 6 cords was the number that kept a man alive in a 12 by 16 cabin at 10,000 feet. Half a cord was the number that kept him alive until the first week of November. But the conditions in Saints Rest were no longer normal. The silver boom had pulled thousands of men into the high camps, miners, teamsters, speculators, gamblers, and the families who followed them hoping for something better than what they had left behind. The wagon roads froze early that year. A freight team overturned on the pass in the 3rd week of October, and 2 wood wagons went down the slope, scattering split pine across a rock field where no one could recover it safely. 3 days later, a night watchman was found beaten beside the company fuel shed, his lantern shattered, and 2 cords missing from the stack. The town elders met that evening in the back room of Blaydell's store. By morning, they had posted an emergency order on every public wall in Saints Rest. The document was written in the careful hand of Judge Orrin T. Kershaw, and it read in part, "No household shall keep more than 1 day's firewood inside or stacked beside a dwelling. Surplus fuel shall be surrendered to the Emergency Committee for Equitable Distribution. Violations shall be met with seizure and fine." They called it civic necessity. They called it fairness. Asa read it nailed to the post outside the assay office while frost gathered on his beard, and he called it a death sentence delivered in clean handwriting. The marshal came on a Tuesday. His name was Enoch Bell, a square-built man with a cavalry mustache and a repeating habit of touching his belt as though confirming the pistol was still there. He brought 2 men from the emergency committee and a mule wagon for hauling. Asa stood in his doorway and watched them stack his wood onto the wagon. 400 pounds of dry pine, split and seasoned through September, carried out of his lean-to in armloads while his breath hung in the still air and his stiff shoulder ached from the cold. Bell handed him a receipt. "1 stove box per day," he said. "You can collect at the fuel station after 7 each morning." "1 box," Asa said. "Same as every man in camp." Asa looked at the receipt. It was signed by Kershaw. "One box burns 6 hours if I damp it hard. The coldest part of the night runs 9, maybe 11. Bell did not answer that. He touched his belt and looked at the committee men, who were already climbing onto the wagon. "Does the law say a man can't store heat?" Asa asked. No one answered. The wagon pulled away down the frozen track, and Asa stood in his doorway holding a piece of paper worth less than the wood it had cost him. 3 days later, Judge Orrin T. Kershaw came to see the cabin for himself. Kershaw was 62, a former probate judge who had survived winters in mining camps before Saints Rest existed. He was thin, deliberate, and precise in the way of men who believed that rules were the only things separating a town from a graveyard. He had written the fuel order because he had seen what happened when panic ruled a camp. Men with axes breaking into sheds, families burning furniture, fights over a single armload of kindling that left one man dead and another crippled. Discipline, Kershaw believed, saved towns. He was not wrong about that. He was wrong about what discipline cost the weakest cabins. He arrived with his coat buttoned to the throat and his ledger under his arm. He did not knock. He pushed the door open, ducked under the lintel, and stood in Asa's cabin with the air of a man inspecting a condemned building. He counted the gaps in the south wall where chinking had crumbled. He lifted the stove lid and looked at the ash. He checked the wood box, which held enough pine for perhaps 4 hours of low fire. He pressed his palm against the east wall and held it there. "Cold comes through here like water through a sieve," he said. "I know it," Asa said. "You have half a frame on the south side. You have maybe a cord and a half of wall between you and the weather, and a third of that wall has gaps I can see daylight through." "I know that too." Kershaw closed his ledger. "A man who stacks 3 cords beside his door is stealing warmth from every widow in this camp. And a man who gives him 1 box a day is burying him before the ground freezes." Kershaw did not flinch. "The order is fair." "The order is fair for a man with 4 solid walls, a tight roof, and a stove that holds heat. I have one of those 3. Kershaw looked around the cabin one more time. He looked at the cracked windows, the rag stuffing, the gap beneath the door where frost was already creeping across the planks. Then he looked at Asa. "You cannot make it on legal fuel," he said. It was not cruelty. It was arithmetic delivered without apology. "Move into town, find a boarding house, share a room." "With what money?" "That is not the committee's concern. It is if I die here and you wrote the paper that made it happen." Kershaw buttoned his coat. At the door he paused. "I have written a fair rule for men in fair houses. If your house is not fair, that is a problem the order did not create." He left. The door swung shut behind him, and the cold he had let in filled the cabin in seconds. That night, Asa sat on his bunk with the charcoal stub and the split board. Tom Rusk crouched beside the stove, feeding the last sticks of the day's ration into the firebox, with the careful attention of a boy who understood that each piece of wood was a measured thing. Tom was 12. His father had died in a mine timber collapse 6 weeks earlier, and his mother, Nell Rusk, washed clothes for the boarding houses to keep them fed. Asa was not sentimental about the arrangement. He brought meat when he could. He had repaired Nell's stove door when the hinge cracked. He let Tom split kindling behind his cabin for a few cents a week. It was not charity. It was the ordinary machinery of staying alive in a place that punished people who stayed alone. Now Asa drew the math on the board while Tom watched. 1 stove box. 6 hours of fire if damped hard. The coldest part of the night lasted 9 to 11 hours. At 20 below, a cabin without fire lost heat faster than a man could feel it leaving. The walls, the floor, the air itself became the enemy. At 40 below, and the old-timers said the gulch pooled cold like a bowl collecting water, a sleeping man might never wake up. "How many boxes would you need?" Tom asked. 2. Maybe 2.5 for the bad nights." "Can you ask for more?" Kershaw gave every cabin the same ration. Asking for more is the same as asking someone else to freeze. Tom stared at the numbers on the board. Then what do you do? Asa did not answer immediately. He looked at the stove, at the thin blue thread of smoke rising from the damper, at the wood box that would be empty by midnight. He thought about Nell coughing in her cabin across the gulch, and Tom walking back to her in the dark through air that hurt to breathe. He could not store wood. Coal was priced beyond him and controlled by the mine office. Kerosene was too scarce for heating. Moving into town cost money he did not have. Leaving meant abandoning Nell and Tom, who had no team, no relatives nearby, and no paid passage south. Every conventional path was closed. The fuel order had seen to that. I don't know yet, Asa said. But a man who can't store fuel has to store something else. Tom looked at him like he was waiting for the rest of the sentence. Asa did not have it yet. The idea did not come as a flash. It came as a sensation in his palm. 4 days after Kershaw's visit, Asa climbed the slope above Saints' Rest to the abandoned Merriman adit. The mine had been worked for silver the previous year and abandoned when the vein pinched out. What remained was a scatter of broken tools, rotted timber, and a waste dump of gray rock and slag that no one had bothered to haul away. Asa was looking for stovepipe. His own had a crack near the elbow joint, and he needed a section of iron he could cut and shape to patch it. He found the pipe. He also found something else. Heaps of lead-rich slag, broken assay weights, pewter mugs from a closed boarding house kitchen, and bars of soft gray metal that miners had used for patching, weighting, and crude repairs. The dump was heavy with the stuff. In a camp built on silver-lead ore, lead was as common as mud. He took the pipe and left. That evening, Tom dropped a cold bullet mold near the stove while sorting scraps for Asa. It clattered on the stone hearth and lay there while they ate. An hour later, Asa picked it up. It was warm, not hot, not dangerous, but warm in a way that thin iron was not. The mold had sat near the stove for an hour and soaked up heat the way a dry cloth soaks up water. Asa held it in his palm and felt the warmth radiating from the dense metal, and something turned over in his memory. He was 8 years old. His father, a wheelwright and part-time foundry hand in western Pennsylvania, stood beside a coal forge pulling a glowing wagon tire from the coals. The iron was orange at the center, dull red at the rim. His father set it on the dirt floor and told Asa to stand back. Don't touch it, his father said. Not now and not in an hour. The iron remembers. Later, after the forge fire had died, his father took 2 pieces of metal outside, a thin strap of iron and a heavy wagon hub, and set them both in the snow. After an hour, he brought Asa close and held the boy's hand above each piece without touching. The thin strap was cold. The heavy hub still pushed warmth against Asa's palm. Why? His father asked. The big one's heavier. The big one holds more, takes longer to get hot, and it takes longer to let go. Remember that. Asa had filed the lesson away the way a child files anything, without understanding what it would cost him to need it. Now, sitting in a cabin that would kill him by February, holding a warm bullet mold in his stiff hand, the lesson returned with the weight of something that had been waiting 38 years to matter. The fuel order forbade storing wood. It forbade hoarding fuel of any kind beside a dwelling. But it said nothing about storing heat. A woodpile was illegal. A kettle of scrap metal was not. If Asa could use his legal daytime fire to heat a dense enough mass, truly dense, hundreds of pounds of it, the mass would absorb heat while the fire burned and release it after the flames died. Not like a stove, which cooled fast because its walls were thin, like the wagon hub his father had set in the snow. The heavier the mass, the longer the heat lingered. He did not know the words for what he was thinking. He had never heard the phrase latent heat of fusion and would not have recognized it if someone had said it. What he knew was simpler and older. Heavy metal holds warmth after fire is gone. If a man cannot keep the fire, he can keep the thing the fire heated. The question was whether it could work at scale. A bullet mold warmed a hand. Could 1,000 pounds of lead warm a room? Bucky. Asa told Merritt Vale first, because Merritt was the closest thing he had to a friend who would not laugh before listening. Merritt was 38, a neighbor and former carpenter who had come to Saints Rest for mine timber work and stayed because leaving cost more than staying. He was practical, methodical, and deeply suspicious of ideas that sounded like desperation dressed in logic. Asa described the plan in Merritt's cabin over weak coffee. A cast-iron kettle, the biggest he could find. Fill it with scrap lead from the Merriman dump. Set it on the stove. Heat it during the legal burn hours. Let it radiate after the fire died. Merritt listened with his arms crossed and his jaw set in the expression of a man who wanted to help but could not see how. You need flame, Asa, not weight. Weight just sits there. Weight holds heat. A rock holds heat. A rock doesn't keep you alive in January. Asa had expected this. He pulled two objects from his coat, a thin iron pan lid and a short lead bar he had carried down from the Merriman dump. He set both on Merritt's stove for 20 minutes while they finished the coffee. Then he moved both to the table. Touch the air above them, Asa said. Don't touch the metal. Merritt held his palm over the pan lid. Cool. He held it over the lead bar. Warmth pushed against his skin. That's a bar, Merritt said. You're talking about a whole stove full. 900 pounds, maybe 1,000. Where are you going to get 1,000 pounds of lead? The Merriman dump, slag, assay weights, pewter scrap, whatever the smelters left behind. Merritt shook his head. And if it doesn't work, you've spent 3 days of legal fire melting metal instead of heating your cabin, cooking food, or drying clothes. You'll have a cold kettle and nothing in your stomach. If I don't try it, I'll have a legal wood ration and a cabin that freezes 4 hours before dawn. Kershaw said it himself. I can't make it on what they're giving me. Kershaw's usually right. Kershaw's right about the math. He's wrong about the answer. Merritt uncrossed his arms. He was not convinced, but he was quieter now, and Asa knew that quiet was the first crack in any wall. The design took shape over 2 days. Asa found a 22-gallon cast-iron sugar kettle in the debris behind the old company boarding house. It was cracked at one handle, but sound at the belly and thick enough to hold weight without splitting. He dragged it back to his cabin on a hand sled, which was the first of many loads that would leave blood in the snow from a reopened cut on his palm. The kettle would sit on the stove, but the stove could not carry that weight alone. Asa calculated 900 pounds of lead, plus the kettle itself, plus the iron lid he would need to keep the surface covered. That was over 1,000 pounds bearing down on a cast iron box with 4 legs designed to hold a coffee pot and a skillet. He would need to reinforce stone piers under the stove belly, wagon tire iron strapped around the legs, a platform of flat rock to distribute the load to the floor joists, and even then, the joists would need checking. The risk was real. If the kettle cracked during a melt, 1,000 pounds of liquid lead would pour out of the break and burn through anything it touched: the stove, the floor, Asa's boots, the cabin itself. If the stove buckled under the weight, the whole assembly could collapse and spill molten metal across a room made of dry wood. And lead was poison. Heating it, handling it, breathing near it, all of it carried danger that Asa understood imperfectly but could not ignore. This was not a clean invention. It was a desperate, heavy, dangerous gamble built from mine trash and a childhood memory. If it worked, Asa would have heat after his fire died. If it failed, he might not survive the failure. Calvin Rusk heard about the plan before the first load of scrap reached Asa's cabin. Calvin was 41, cousin of Nell's dead husband and a part owner in a private wood contract that sold emergency fuel bundles at prices that rose with the temperature's fall. He was not a villain in the storybook sense. He was a man who had found a way to profit from scarcity and understood that Asa's scheme, if it worked, threatened the fear that made his business possible. Calvin told men at Blaisdell's store what Asa was doing. His voice carried the easy humor of a man who expects agreement. "Varden's cooking mine trash. Let him. When he freezes, I'll sell the kettle by the pound." The laughter came easily. In a camp where men counted sticks of wood like coins, the image of a man dragging hundreds of pounds of dead gray metal into his cabin was absurd. Someone asked if Asa meant to eat the lead. Someone else said he was building a coffin too heavy for 6 men to carry. The jokes had the comfortable cruelty of people who need someone else's failure to feel better about their own odds. Calvin did not stop at mockery. He walked to Kershaw's cabin that evening and suggested the emergency committee investigate whether Asa's kettle constituted a fire hazard or an illegal fuel store. "It's metal, Calvin," Kershaw said. "Metal doesn't burn. Molten metal does damage. If that kettle cracks, then Varden has a problem, not the committee." Calvin pressed. "He's defying the spirit of the order." "He's obeying the letter. The order governs fuel. Scrap bleed is not fuel." Kershaw paused, and something shifted in his expression. Not sympathy, but the irritation of a man whose own law was being tested in ways he had not anticipated. "I'll inspect the cabin. If he's hiding wood, I'll act. If he's melting rocks, that's his business and his risk." The inspection came 2 days later. Kershaw arrived with Marshal Bell and one committee man. They found Asa's cabin stripped to its bones. No extra wood. No hidden fuel. The stove held the day's legal ration, half burned. The sugar kettle sat on the stone platform Asa had begun building, empty except for a first layer of gray scrap. Bell looked at the kettle, looked at the stove, and looked at Kershaw. "No violation," Bell said. Kershaw walked the perimeter of the cabin. He checked the wood box. He looked under the bunk. He opened the flour sack and the bean crock as though a man might hide pine splits among his food. He found nothing because there was nothing to find. He stopped beside the kettle and rested his hand on the rim. "Cold iron. You may obey the letter and still die by the sense," Kershaw said. Asa met his eyes. "Then I'll take the letter tonight." Kershaw left without another word. But the visit had consequences beyond the inspection itself. Nell Rusk was warned by a neighbor woman not to let Tom help Asa anymore. The association was dangerous, the woman said. If Asa's scheme failed, or worse, if the committee decided the kettle was a hazard, anyone connected to him would share the trouble. Merritt Vale stopped speaking to Asa for 2 days. Not out of anger, but out of the quiet, practical fear of a man who did not want to be associated with someone the committee was watching. Calvin spread a new rumor. Asa was hiding fuel underground, beneath the cabin floor. 2 men from the committee came back and checked. They found packed earth, stone piers, and nothing else. The law could not stop Asa. So the camp used what the law could not reach: shame, suspicion, and the steady pressure of people who watched his door and waited for the failure they were certain would come. Asa began hauling scrap from the Merriman adit on the first night of November. He worked after dark, not because the law required it, but because Calvin's men watched the trail during daylight, and every trip Asa made with a loaded sled invited questions, inspections, and the slow grinding attention of people who had decided he was either a fool or a threat. The hand sled was a plank frame with iron runners that Asa had built from a broken wagon gate. It carried 80 to 100 pounds per load, which was enough to make the downhill trip dangerous on frozen ground and the return trip empty a relief that lasted only until the next load. The first night, he made 2 trips. 160 pounds of mixed scrap, lead bars, slag chunks, broken assay weights, and a handful of pewter mugs so tarnished they looked like stones. He sorted them by the stove light, setting aside anything that crumbled or felt too light to be worth the space. His palm bled from the reopened cut where the sled rope had torn the skin. His shoulder burned from the old trapline injury. He wrapped the hand in a strip of flour sack, set the scrap beside the kettle, and slept for 4 hours before the cold woke him. The second night, another 100 pounds. The third night, the same. By the fourth morning, the kettle held its first layer of scrap, and the stone platform beneath the stove was bearing weight it had never been designed to carry. On the fifth day, the stove frame bent. Asa heard it before he saw it, a low metallic groan from the front left leg, where the weight of the kettle had slowly compressed the cast iron beyond its tolerance. He pulled the kettle off the stove using the iron hook Merritt had lent him weeks earlier for hanging game, and he stared at the buckled leg the way a man stares at a crack in a dam. If the stove collapsed under the kettle, everything was finished. The kettle, the scrap, the stove itself, the cabin floor, all of it would be ruined, and he would be left with no stove, no heat, and no legal way to replace either one. He needed help. He needed someone who understood weight, metal, and how to make one hold the other without breaking. Tom Rusk appeared at the door that evening with a flour sack full of small pewter scraps he had gathered from the trash heap behind the boarding house. He set the sack down and saw the bent stove leg. "What happened?" Tom asked. "Too much weight, not enough support," Asa said. "I need to rebuild the frame before I load another pound." "Can you fix it?" Asa looked at the stove, at the kettle waiting on the floor, at the bent leg that meant the difference between a chance and a ruin. He thought about his father's forge, where heavy things sat on heavy things, and nothing moved because every piece had been placed with knowledge Asa did not fully possess. "Not alone," he said. "Tell us in the comments, have you ever been doubted by people who could see your work, but not the reason behind it?" The next morning, Asa walked to the forge shed behind the assay office, where an old Norwegian named Tollef Brekke repaired picks, sharpened drill steel, and kept a fire that smelled of coal and iron scale. Tollef was 67, white-haired, slow-moving, and precise in the way of men who had spent decades heating metal and shaping it before it cooled. He had worked in Midwestern foundries and later in Colorado smelting yards before lung trouble forced him into lighter work. He coughed more than he spoke, and when he spoke, he said exactly what he meant. Asa did not explain the plan with enthusiasm or persuasion. He described the problem: a stove that needed to carry 1,000 pounds, legs that buckled at 400, and a man who could not reinforce them alone. Tollef listened. He did not laugh. He asked 2 questions. "What kind of stove?" "Standard box, cast iron, 4 legs, no skirt." "And the kettle?" 22-gallon sugar kettle, cracked handle, sound belly." Tollef coughed into his sleeve, looked at the forge ceiling, and said, "Show me." He followed Asa to the cabin. He did not walk fast. He studied the stove the way a doctor studies a patient, pressing the legs, tapping the plate, rocking the frame to feel where the stress traveled. He looked at the stone platform, at the kettle, at the scrap piled beside the wall. "You can't carry this on legs," Tollef said. "Legs are for stoves. You need piers." He crouched beside the stove slowly, with the care of a man whose knees had earned every complaint, and pointed to the belly. Stone piers here and here fitted tight under the firebox. Wagon tire iron wrapped around the legs, not for strength, but to keep them from spreading. The weight goes through the piers to the floor, not through the legs to the joints. Will it hold 1,000 pounds? Tolliff looked at Asa the way a man looks at someone who has asked the right question. If the floor holds, the piers hold. Check your joists. If any of them are cracked or punky, replace them first. No point building a table on a rotten floor. Tolliff did not offer to help as a charity. He had seen Asa weighing scrap by hand, rejecting brittle dross, checking the stove legs before loading. He recognized competence the way a craftsman recognizes another craftsman's hands, not by what they said, but by what they did without being told. The help he gave was not kindness. It was the response of a man who saw someone working correctly and understood that correct work, left unsupported, could still fail. They spent the rest of the day fitting stone piers under the stove belly. Tolliff selected the stones himself from a pile behind the forge shed, testing each one with a hammer tap and discarding any that rang hollow. He showed Asa how to seat them flush against the firebox bottom, shimming with iron shims cut from an old hinge plate. By evening, the stove sat on a foundation that could hold a loaded freight wagon. The bent leg was straightened with heat and hammer. The wagon tire iron, cut from a discarded rim Tolliff kept in his scrap pile, wrapped the legs in a cradle that turned 4 separate points of failure into one continuous frame. Asa loaded the first 100 pounds of scrap into the kettle. The stove did not move. The piers held. The floor joists, which Asa had checked that morning by crawling under the cabin in frozen mud, bore the weight without complaint. Tolliff stood in the doorway, coughing softly. "Tomorrow," he said, "I'll show you how to sort the metal. Not everything in that dump is worth heating. Some of it will crack your kettle from the inside." He left without waiting for thanks. Asa stood beside the loaded kettle in the fading light and listened to the stove tick as the fire settled. Outside, snow had begun to fall, light, dry flakes that hissed against the cabin wall like whispered warnings. The temperature was dropping. The kettle was a fifth full. The stove frame held, but the hardest work had not yet started. And somewhere below in the camp, Calvin Rusk was telling men at the store that Asa Varden had gone so far around the bend that he was hiring a sick old Norwegian to help him cook rocks. The snow kept falling. The fire would die by midnight, and the cold was coming. Tolliff Brecka arrived at Asa's cabin the next morning before the legal wood ration had been collected. He carried a short-handled file with notches cut along the spine, marks he had made over decades of testing soft metal, and a leather roll of tools so worn the handles had taken the permanent shape of his grip. He did not begin with the stove. He began with the scrap pile. Asa had hauled everything he could find at the Merriman dump without much discrimination. Tolliff crouched beside the heap and picked up the first piece, a flat bar of gray metal, heavy for its size. He nicked it with the file. The file bit cleanly, leaving a bright silver scratch. "Clean lead," Tolliff said. "This is good." He picked up the next piece, a chunk of dark slag with a glassy surface. He nicked it. The file skated across without biting. He dropped the slag on the floor away from the pile. "Dross, full of silica and ash. It will crack inside the melt and pop like a rifle shot." Piece by piece, he sorted through the heap. He taught Asa to listen. Clean lead sounded dull when tapped, like tapping a closed fist on a table. Brittle slag rang higher, thinner. Pewter, the old kind, heavy with lead, fell somewhere between, and the file left a darker scratch than pure lead did. "The mugs are good," Tolliff said, turning a tarnished pewter cup in his hands. "Old pewter, plenty of lead in the alloy, melts lower than bar stock, which means it flows first and fills the gaps between the heavy pieces." "What about the assay weights?" Tolliff tested one. "Lead and antimony, harder than bar stock, but it melts close enough. Keep 'em. By noon, the scrap pile had been divided into 3 groups: clean lead and heavy pewter for the kettle, questionable mixed metal that might be added later, and worthless dross that Asa hauled back outside and dumped in the snow. The sorting cost him a quarter of his collected scrap, but what remained was dense, consistent, and safe to heat without the risk of trapped moisture or brittle inclusions that could shatter inside a molten pool. The next lesson was harder. Tolov insisted that the first melt go slowly. He stood beside the stove while Asa fed his legal wood ration into the firebox and watched the kettle heat. You melt in layers, Tolov said. First the pewter, because it flows soonest. You set the pewter in the bottom of the kettle with the smallest pieces on top. When the pewter softens and begins to pool, you add bar stock, 1 bar at a time, never 2. Never cold wet metal into hot metal. Why not? Because water trapped in a cold bar turns to steam inside the melt. Steam under lead is a bomb. He coughed and wiped his mouth. I have seen a man lose his face from it. Pour slow, pour dry. Keep the lid ready. Asa placed the first layer of pewter scraps in the kettle, mugs, spoon handles, a battered plate, and set the iron lid on top, tilted to let steam escape. The stove groaned under the weight, but the piers held. The wagon tire iron cradle kept the legs from spreading. An hour passed. The legal wood burned steadily. The kettle grew too hot to touch, and the air above the lid shimmered. Tolov checked the temperature by holding his palm 6 inches from the kettle wall, counting silently, then pulling away. Not yet, he said. When you cannot hold your hand at this distance for a count of 3, the pewter is moving. Another half hour. Asa held his hand near the wall. The heat pushed him back before he reached 2. Now, Tolov said. Asa lifted the lid with an iron hook. Inside, the pewter had lost its shape. The mugs and plates were no longer recognizable. A dull silver pool covered the bottom of the kettle, thick and slow, reflecting the orange light from the firebox below. The heat rising from the open kettle hit Asa's face, like standing too close to a bonfire. First bar, Tolov said. Asa lowered a dry lead bar. He had set it near the stove for an hour to drive off any surface moisture into the pool. It sank into the pewter and disappeared. A few seconds later, a thin wisp of smoke curled from the surface. Good, Tolov said. That is lead releasing impurities. It will stop. Wait. The smoke thinned and died. The surface of the pool steadied. Next bar. They worked through the afternoon, adding metal in stages, pausing between each addition to let the temperature stabilize. The cabin filled with a smell Asa had not encountered since his father's forge. Hot metal, faintly sweet, with an undertone of something acrid that caught in the back of the throat. Tolov tied a wet cloth over his nose and told Asa to do the same. Lead smoke is slow poison, he said. You will not feel it today. You will feel it in 10 years. Keep the lid on. Keep the rag wet. Work up wind when you can. By sunset, the kettle held the first full layer of molten metal, perhaps 300 pounds, pooled 4 inches deep and glowing with a dull heat that made the iron walls of the kettle too bright to look at directly. Asa set the lid in place. The legal fire died. The stove went dark, but the kettle did not. 2 hours after the fire died, Asa held his hand above the lid. Heat rose through the iron like breath from a sleeping animal, not fire heat, not the sharp blast of a burning stove, something slower, heavier, more patient. The metal was giving back what the fire had put in, and it was doing it at its own pace. At midnight, the stove was cold to the touch. The cabin walls were frosting at the corners, but the air within 3 feet of the kettle was still warm enough that Asa could sit beside it without his breath fogging. It was not enough. 300 pounds held heat for hours, not days. By morning, the kettle was merely warm, and the cabin had dropped below freezing. But the proof was there. The metal remembered. He needed 3 times the mass. He needed to fill the kettle to the rim. The hauling resumed. Each night, after the legal fire died and the camp settled into the dark silence of men conserving warmth behind closed doors, Asa pulled the hand sled up the slope to the Merriman at it. 80 pounds down, empty sled back. 80 more. His torn palm opened and opened again until the skin grew a callus over the wound that was harder than the rope that had made it. Tom helped when Nell allowed it, carrying pewter scraps in a flour sack slung over his thin shoulder. The boy did not complain. He walked behind Asa in the dark and matched his pace without being asked, which was the kind of competence that earned respect in a place where incompetence killed. Progress markers, tracked on the splitboard in charcoal. Day 7. The kettle held its first full melt layer, 300 pounds of mixed lead and pewter, solid and gray after cooling, with a surface like frozen pond water. Day 8. Asa added another 100 pounds of dry bar stock on top of the cooled first layer. When the legal fire heated the kettle the next morning, the new metal softened on top while the old layer beneath it began to warm through. The heat moved downward slowly, waking the mass from the top like sunlight thawing ice. Day 10. The total mass approached 700 pounds. The stove piers held. The floor joists held. But the stove plate, the flat top where the kettle sat, had begun to warp from the sustained heat, bowing slightly downward in the center. Tolliff checked it by laying a straight iron bar across the plate and sighting along the edge. "It will hold," he said. "But you cannot overfire. If the plate warps more than a finger's width, the kettle shifts. A shifted kettle on a hot stove is a spill." "How do I know when I'm too hot?" "Watch the plate seams. When they glow, you are too hot. Damp the fire before the seams show color." On the 11th night, a setback nearly ended everything. Asa had added a chunk of scrap that looked dry, but had a pocket of ice trapped inside a fold of metal, moisture that had seeped into a crack and frozen there without being visible. When the chunk hit the molten pool, the ice flashed to steam. The steam expanded under the surface of the lead and erupted upward. The pop was not loud. It sounded like a hand clapping once, hard. But a spray of hot lead spattered against the underside of the iron lid, and one droplet escaped through the gap where the lid met the rim. It landed on Asa's left sleeve. The wool smoked instantly. Asa felt the heat before he felt the pain, a bright, specific point of burning that cut through the cold air like a needle. He jerked his arm back. Tolliff moved faster than a 67-year-old man should have been able to move. He slapped the smoking sleeve with his bare palm, smothering the ember. The wool hissed and went dark. Neither man spoke for a full breath. Then Tolliff said, "Every piece goes near the stove for an hour before it goes in the kettle. Every piece, no exceptions. If you're tired, you wait. If you're cold, you wait. If you're in a hurry, you wait longer." Asa looked at the burn hole in his sleeve. Beneath it, a blister was already forming on his forearm, small and white and precise. "I understand," he said. "You understand now," Tolliff said. Understanding before would have been better. They did not speak again that night. But from that point forward, every piece of scrap spent an hour on the hearthstones before it touched the melt. The rule added time. It may have saved Asa's life. Calvin Rusk did not let the matter rest. On the 12th day, Calvin told Marshal Bell that Asa was storing contraband fuel beneath his cabin floor. The accusation was specific enough that Bell could not ignore it. He came with 2 committee men and searched the cabin for the second time. They checked under the bunk. They checked the crawl space beneath the floor, where Asa had to pull away stones so they could see the joists in the frozen dirt. They found nothing that burned. Bell looked at the kettle, now holding over 700 pounds of cooling lead, and asked what it was. "Scrap metal," Asa said. "What's it for?" "Keeping me alive." Bell shook his head and left, but the search had cost Asa half a day's legal fire, time he had spent opening the crawl space and replacing the stones instead of heating the kettle. That same week, a storm delayed the legal wood delivery by 2 days. The fuel station ran out of bundled rations on a Wednesday and did not restock until Friday. For 2 days, Asa had no wood at all. The cabin dropped to freezing. The kettle, 3/4 full, sat cold and useless, a 1,000-pound reminder that the method required fire to work, and fire required fuel, and fuel required the goodwill of a committee that had none to spare. Those 2 days were the closest Asa came to quitting. He sat in his cabin wrapped in every blanket he owned, breathing air that frosted his beard, and wondered whether Merritt had been right all along. Weight just sits there. On the morning of the 3rd day, when the rations resumed, Asa found 2 flat stones leaning against his cabin wall. They were smooth, heavy, and perfectly sized to fit beneath the stove as additional support. He found Merritt Vale standing in the track 30 yards away, not looking at the cabin. "Those won't burn," Merritt said, "so I suppose they're legal." He walked away before Asa could answer. But the stones were there, and the message was clear. Merritt had not stopped watching, and he had not stopped thinking. By the 20th of December, the kettle held nearly 1,000 pounds of mixed lead and pewter scrap. The mass filled the sugar kettle to within 3 inches of the rim, a dense gray lake of metal that, when heated to melting during the legal burn hours, threw such violent heat from its surface that Asa could not stand within arm's reach of the open lid. The stove corner of the cabin had been transformed. Stone piers supported the stove belly. Wagon tire iron wrapped the legs. Merritt's flat stones braced the base. Tamped earth filled the gaps between stone and floor. The iron lid that covered the kettle, cut from a salvaged boilerplate and filed smooth by Tollef, weighed 40 pounds by itself. The cabin smelled of hot metal, ash, and damp wool. Asa performed the first real test on the 21st. He burned his legal wood ration from morning until sunset, firing the stove hot enough to soften the top layers of the lead mass. The kettle glowed dull red along its belly. The stove seams showed color. He damped the fire as Tollef had taught him, letting the flames die slowly so the heat transferred inward rather than escaping up the pipe. At sunset, the fire was dead. The stove went dark. The kettle did not. Asa hung a tin cup of water on an iron nail driven into the wall beside the stove. At midnight, 6 hours after the fire had died, he checked it. The water was cool but liquid. No ice. No frost on the cup's surface. He moved the cup to the far wall, 12 feet from the kettle. By 1 in the morning, ice had skinned over the water. Near the stove, alive. Far from the stove, freezing. The difference was the kettle. Merritt came the next morning. Asa showed him the 2 cups, one still liquid, one frozen solid. Merritt held his hand near the kettle and pulled it back. "That's still warm," he said. "After how many hours?" 12. Merritt said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "It's not the same as surviving a real cold snap. 10 below is one thing, 30 below is another." Kershaw heard about the test through the committee. He came that afternoon and stood in Asa's cabin looking at the kettle, the cups, and the frost patterns on the walls. The near wall was dry. The far wall was white. A trick that works at 10 below may fail at 30 below, Kershaw said. I've seen men die trusting things that worked in November. Tolef, who was sitting on a stool near the door, spoke without looking up. The kettle stores heat. It does not create it. If Asa fires it hard enough before the cold hits, the mass holds longer. If the cold outlasts the mass, the cold wins. Then it is a gamble, Kershaw said. Everything in this camp is a gamble, Asa said. Yours included. Kershaw left without answering, but he did not send the marshal. The storm arrived on the 28th of December. It did not announce itself gradually. It came down from the pass like something falling, and within an hour the sky above Saints' Rest had closed to a flat gray ceiling that pressed against the ridgeline and erased the mountains beyond. Wind drove snow under doors, through chinking gaps, and into every crack that Asa had failed to seal. The temperature began dropping at noon and did not stop. By sunset, the thermometer outside Blaydell's store read 15 below. By midnight, the mercury had fallen past 30 below and was still sinking. Men who had lived in the gulch for years said the cold pooled at the bottom of the drainage like water filling a ditch, and the cabins on the low ground got the worst of it. The emergency committee reduced rations. What had been 1 stove box per day became 3/4 rations, barely enough to cook a meal and warm a room for 4 hours. The wood wagons could not move on the pass. No one knew when they would move again. Asa heard the reduction order from Tom, who had run through the snow from the fuel station, with his face raw from the wind. 3/4 box, Tom said. Starting now. Asa did not waste words. He loaded the stove with everything the reduced ration gave him and fired it as hot as the dampers allowed. The kettle began to warm. The stove seams glowed. Tolef, who had come that morning and refused to leave, watched the seams and said nothing until the color deepened from dull red toward orange. Damp it, Tolef said. Not yet. Damp it now. You will crack the plate. Asa closed the damper halfway. The fire settled. The kettle continued absorbing heat, not from flame now, but from the mass of coals banked thick against the firebox walls. This was the slower transfer, the patient kind, the kind that pushed heat deep into the lead rather than wasting it against the cabin air. Then Nell arrived. Tom had gone to check on her and come back pulling her by the arm. She was coughing, not the dry cough of cold air, but the deep, wet sound of lung fever taking hold. Her stove had cracked along a seam that morning. Calvin Rusk, who controlled the nearest private wood supply, had refused credit. The boarding house where she washed clothes had closed its doors against the storm. She stood in Asa's doorway wrapped in a blanket that was already stiff with frost, and she did not ask to come in. She just stood there with Tom beside her, and the question was not whether Asa would help, but what it would cost. Bringing Nell and Tom into the cabin meant 3 people drawing heat from a system designed for 1. It meant more body heat, which helped, but also more open doors, more movement, more demand on warmth that had nowhere to replenish. Every breath they took warmed the room slightly and consumed the air that kept the stove drawing. Asa brought them in. He did not calculate the cost first. He calculated it after, which was the order of a man who had already decided. The first night unfolded in hours that felt like days. At 4 p.m, the fire was burning the last of the reduced ration. Asa fed it slowly, spreading each stick across a bed of coals so thick and even that the firebox glowed through the cast iron. The kettle absorbed heat like a living thing, the top layer softening, losing the solid gray sheen and beginning to move sluggishly when Asa tapped the rim with an iron rod. Below the surface, the deeper mass was still solid but warming, conducting the fire's energy downward through 1,000 pounds of dense metal. At 6, the patrol came. 2 committeemen stood in the snow outside Asa's cabin and confirmed that he had no extra wood. The fire was burning its final sticks. The men noted the kettle, which they had been told about but had not seen. One of them held his hand near the wall and felt the heat radiating from inside. "What is that?" he asked. "Legal," Asa said. They left. The fire died at 7. Asa closed the damper, sealed the firebox door, and sat down on the bunk beside Nell, who was coughing into a folded cloth. Tom sat on the floor near the stove, wrapped in a horse blanket, with his back against the stone pier. The stove was dark. The cabin was silent except for the wind outside and Nell's breathing, and the kettle radiated. It was not comfortable heat. It was not the cheerful warmth of a burning stove that fills a room and makes a man forget the weather. It was something heavier, more concentrated, a pulse of warmth that extended 3 feet from the kettle wall and weakened sharply beyond that. Near the stove, the air was warm enough to dry frost from the nearby wall. At the far end of the cabin, 12 feet away, the temperature was already dropping toward the point where water freezes. Asa moved the bunk closer to the stove. He piled every blanket they had on Nell and told Tom to sleep on the floor against the stone pier, where the reflected heat from the wall would catch him. At midnight, 6 hours after the fire had died, Asa checked the tin cup of water hanging beside the stove. Liquid. He checked the far wall. Ice. The cabin was alive in its center and dying at its edges. Nell coughed through the night. Tom woke every hour and put his hand near the kettle lid, not touching it. The lid was still too hot to touch, but feeling the heat that rose through the iron like a slow exhalation. Each time he felt it, he settled back and slept again. The warmth was his signal that the world had not yet ended. At 3 a.m, Asa pressed his palm against the cabin wall near the door. Frost had crept across the planks in a solid white sheet. He moved to the stove corner. The wall was dry. The air held that faint metallic sweetness of hot lead, not strong, not dangerous at this temperature, but present, a reminder that the thing keeping them alive was also the thing that could poison them if the room stayed sealed too long. He cracked the window rag an inch. Cold air knifed through the gap. He closed it after 30 seconds, enough to turn the air, not enough to kill the warmth. Morning came gray and windless. The storm had not passed. It had paused. The thermometer at Blaydell's store read 34 below. The cold was pooling in the gulch, and Saint's Rest sat at the bottom. Asa checked the cup. Still liquid. 14 hours without fire, and the water beside the stove had not frozen. The kettle had held. But the storm was not finished, and neither was the crisis. On the second day, a boy of 9 appeared at Asa's door, shaking so hard he could not speak clearly. His name was Dent, and he had been sent by his aunt, Mrs. Elian Ward, whose cabin sat 100 yards below Asa's on the gulch side. Mrs. Ward's stovepipe had separated at the joint during the wind. Her cabin had no usable heat. She was alone with her younger daughter, and the daughter was sick. The boy had walked 100 yards through air that burned exposed skin in minutes, and his hands were white at the fingertips. Asa pulled him inside. Tollef wrapped the boy's hands in a warm cloth and held them against the kettle wall, not the lid, which was still dangerously hot, but the lower belly where the temperature was high enough to warm without burning. "I can't move the kettle," Asa said. He looked at Tollef. "Can we send stones?" Tollef nodded. They heated 2 of Merritt's flat stones against the kettle's base, wrapped them in sacking, and sent Tom with them to Ward's cabin along with blankets and instructions. Crowd the sick girl near the warmth. Keep the door sealed. Keep the stones close. The stones would lose heat within hours, but hours might be enough to reach the next morning when the fuel ration resumed. Tom went. The boy stayed, thawing slowly beside the kettle with the quiet gratitude of a child who had been very near a line he did not fully understand. If you're invested in Asa's gamble, subscribe and stay with us, because the next hours decide whether this was genius or madness. The second night was worse. The reduced ration had given Asa barely enough fire to reheat the kettle mass. He had burned every stick by mid-afternoon, pushing the stove harder than Tolef wanted, watching the plate seams glow while Tolef stood with his hand on the damper and said nothing because there was nothing to say. The choice was between cracking the stove plate and letting 3 people freeze. The plate held, but only because the piers absorbed the warping and the wagon tire frame kept the legs from giving. By 8 that evening, the fire was dead again. The kettle's surface had been heated to near melting, but the wind had picked up, and the cabin was losing heat through the chinking gaps faster than the night before. At 10 o'clock, Merritt Vale kicked snow off his boots at the door. He was carrying the boy from Ward's cabin, Dent, who had tried to walk back with another heated stone for his aunt and collapsed in the drift 50 yards from Asa's wall. Merritt set the boy on the floor near the stove and looked at Asa with an expression that was not admiration and not fear, but something between them. "The boy would have died out there," Merritt said. "I know. Ward's cabin is finished. Her pipe is gone and the door won't seal." "Bring them here." Merritt stared. "That's 6 people in a 12 by 16 room with no fire." "The kettle doesn't know how many people are in the room." Merritt left. He came back 20 minutes later with Mrs. Ward, her daughter wrapped in a quilt, and a face full of snow that had already frozen to his eyebrows. 6 people, 1 kettle, no fire, and the storm showing no sign of breaking. The cabin contracted around them. Asa pushed the bunk against the stove wall and laid Nell and the Ward girl side by side under every blanket they had. Tom and Dent slept on the floor between the stove piers, pressed against the warm stone. Merritt sat with his back to the door, the coldest spot, and did not complain. Mrs. Ward sat beside her daughter and held the girl's hand and said nothing for hours. The kettle radiated, not enough for comfort, not enough for warmth in any way a man would recognize as pleasant, but enough. Enough to keep the air in the stove corner above freezing while the far corners of the cabin crusted with ice. Enough to keep 6 people from crossing the line between shivering and dying. At 2 in the morning, Asa heard Kershaw's voice outside. The judge had been making rounds. He had checked 4 cabins on the gulch side and found 2 of them dangerously cold and 1 empty. The occupants had fled to the boarding house, which was burning its furniture. He had come to Asa's cabin expecting to find a dead man or a desperate one. He found 6 people alive in a room with no fire. Kershaw stood in the doorway and looked at the kettle, which was giving off a faint shimmer of heat visible in the lantern light. He looked at the frost on the far walls and the dry wood near the stove. He looked at Nell sleeping, and Tom sleeping, and the Ward girl sleeping. "How long since the fire went out?" Kershaw asked. 7 hours, Asa said. Kershaw said nothing. He closed the door gently because he understood that every second it stood open cost heat that could not be replaced. By the 3rd morning, the storm broke. The sky cracked open to a white sun that threw light but no warmth across the gulch. The thermometer at Blaydell's store read 28 below, which was warmer than the night before but still cold enough to kill an unprotected man in an hour. The wood wagons had not arrived. The fuel ration was still 3/4, but the wind had stopped, and that alone was enough to change the arithmetic of survival. Asa checked the kettle. The surface had crusted solid, a gray rough skin of frozen lead covering a mass that was still warm deep inside. Tolef, who had slept sitting upright against the wall, reached for an iron rod and tapped the kettle's side. He listened to the sound with his head tilted, the way a man listens to a heartbeat through a wall. "Still warm in the belly," Tolef said. "Not hot, but warm." 36 hours without a fire. The cabin corner had stayed above freezing, barely grudgingly by a margin so thin that a single broken window would have erased it. But above freezing was alive, and below freezing was not, and the distance between those two facts was measured in the 1,000 pounds of scrap lead that Asa Varden had dragged down a mountain on a hand sled while his neighbors laughed. Nell's water cup had not frozen. Tom's boots, set near the stove the night before, had thawed. Asa's hands blistered when he lifted the kettle lid too soon because the underside still held enough heat to burn skin at a touch. Not warm, not comfortable, not safe in any way that a man with a roaring stove would recognize, but alive. Merritt Vale sat against the wall with frost in his beard and looked at the kettle as though seeing it for the first time. "Wait," he said quietly. "You were right. Wait remembers." Outside, Calvin Rusk's locked woodshed stood full while the camp around it shivered. The fuel order remained in effect. The emergency committee had saved nobody. And Asa Varden's ugly, dangerous, illegal-looking kettle of melted mine scrap had kept 6 people alive through the worst night in the history of Saints' Rest. The crisis was over. The questions were just beginning. The wood wagons arrived on the 30th of December, 2 days after the storm broke. By then, 3 cabins in Saints' Rest had been abandoned, and one man, a placer miner named Harwick, who lived alone on the far side of the gulch, had been found frozen in his bed with his stove door open and his wood box empty. The emergency committee posted the death in Blaydell's store ledger without comment. Harwick had been within the legal ration. He had obeyed the rule. The rule had not saved him. Asa did not attend the burial. He spent the day repairing chinking in the south wall while Nell rested and Tom carried water from the creek. Kershaw returned on the 2nd of January. He came alone this time. No marshal, no committee men, no ledger under his arm. He knocked on the door and waited, which was the first time he had done either. Asa opened the door. Kershaw stood in the cold, with his coat open at the throat and his hat in his hand. He looked older than he had 3 weeks before. The storm had aged him in the way that consequences age a man who has made rules for other people's lives. "May I come in?" Kershaw said. It was not a question in the way his previous visits had been questions. It was a request. Asa stepped aside. Kershaw walked to the kettle. He stood beside it and rested his hand on the iron lid, which was cool now. The fire had been burning normally since the rations resumed, and the kettle was being heated at a steady pace rather than the desperate overfiring of the crisis. He lifted the lid an inch and felt the warmth rise from the metal beneath. He replaced it carefully. He looked at the cracked handle, the warped stove plate, the stone piers, the wagon tire frame around the legs. He looked at the dry wall near the stove and the frost-scarred wall at the far end. He looked at the bunk pushed close to the stove and the blankets piled where 6 people had slept through the worst night in the camp's history. "How many hours without fire?" Kershaw asked. 36 on the worst night. The corner stayed above freezing. The rest of the cabin did not. "And the people?" 6. Nell, Tom, Mrs. Ward, her daughter, the ward boy, and myself. Merritt brought the boy in the wards after the boy collapsed. Kershaw was quiet for a long time. He traced a finger along the rim of the kettle, the way a man traces the edge of something he's trying to understand not with his mind, but with his hand. He had spent his career believing that order, written, enforced, impartial, was the only thing that stood between a mining camp and chaos. The fuel order had been his finest piece of civic logic. equal rations, equal burden, no one hoarding while others froze. But equal rations assumed equal houses, and the houses were not equal. A tight four-wall cabin with a sound roof and good chinking held its legal ration like a cup holds water. Asa's cabin, with its crumbling south wall and cracked windows, lost heat like a cracked cup loses everything. The ration gave every man the same amount of water. It did not ask whether his cup could hold it. I wrote a fair rule for men with fair houses, Kershaw said. I did not write one for this. Asa could have pressed the point. He could have named Harik, frozen in his bed within the law. He did not. The rule wasn't wrong, Asa said. Men were stealing wood. If you hadn't stopped it, the whole camp might have burned itself out fighting over fuel. But the rule assumed every house loses heat the same way, Asa continued. They don't. A tight cabin with 4 good walls holds heat like a cup holds water. My cabin was a sieve. The rule gave me enough water for a cup. I needed it for a sieve. And you built yourself a cup. I built something that holds heat when the fire can't. That's all it is. Kershaw put his hat back on. At the door, he paused. The committee will not interfere with your method. I will make sure of that. And the ration? The ration stays. But I will recommend that the committee inspect cabin quality before next winter. Equal fuel makes no sense if the houses are not equal. It was not an apology. It was not a reversal. It was a man adjusting his theory to accommodate evidence he had seen with his own eyes. And for a man like Kershaw, that adjustment cost more than most apologies. The visitors began the next day. The first was a man named Party, who lived 3 cabins downhill and had spent the storm-burning chair legs. He stood in Asa's doorway and looked at the kettle with the expression of a man who had been told a story he did not believe, and now had to believe it because the evidence was sitting on a reinforced stove throwing heat into the room. How does it work? Party asked. Asa explained in the simplest terms he could find. Heavy metal takes heat slowly and gives it back slowly. The heavier the mass, the longer it holds. Lead is the heaviest thing he could get in quantity. The kettle absorbs heat during the fire and releases it after. Party asked if he could build one. Not with lead, Asa said. Not unless you reinforce your floor, brace your stove, and know how to melt without killing yourself. The scrap pops if it's wet. The fumes are poison. The liquid burns through anything it touches. Then what do I do? Stone. Line the wall behind your stove with flat stones stacked tight. They won't hold heat as long as lead, but they'll hold it longer than air. Party left. The next morning, 2 more men came. Then a woman named Ingalls, who lived alone with 2 children, and whose stove corner was the coldest in the gulch because her cabin sat on bare rock with no insulation beneath the floor. Asa told her to start with the floor, pack earth and sawdust under the boards before touching the walls. Heat lost downward was heat lost invisibly, and most people never thought to check beneath their feet. Then came Scavenged, the miner with the iron ammunition box. He had already been experimenting on his own, filling the box with chain links and heating it on his stoveplate. He wanted to know why his box cooled faster than he expected. Asa looked at the box. Too thin, he said. The walls radiate heat outward, almost as fast as the chain gives it up. You need mass around the mass, stone behind it, stone beneath it. The box has to sit inside something heavy, or it's just a hot iron shell cooling in the wind. Scavenged nodded. He was the kind of man who heard a correction and improved rather than argued, and within a week he had surrounded his ammunition box with a stone cradle that doubled its heat retention. Each person who came required a different explanation, because each cabin had a different weakness. Asa learned to ask before he answered. How thick are your walls? Is your floor wood or earth? Where does the draft come from? The questions shaped the advice, and the advice shaped the result. A stone wall was useless if the cabin leaked heat through the floor. An iron box was wasted if the stove itself was cracked and venting warmth out the side. He taught Tom first because Tom was young enough to learn the principle before the technique. One afternoon, Asa heated two objects on the stove, a thin iron pan and a thick piece of lead plate. After an hour, he pulled both off and set them on the stone hearth. "Put your hand above them," Asa said. "Don't touch." Tom held his palm over the pan. Nothing. He moved it over the lead plate. Warmth pushed against his skin like breath from a sleeping animal. "Which one remembers?" Asa asked. "The heavy one." "Why?" Tom thought about it. "It took longer to get hot, so it takes longer to let go." "Then build heavy where the fire already is. That's the whole thing, Tom. Everything else is just deciding what kind of heavy and where to put it." Tom nodded. He did not know that the lesson had first been given by a wheelwright in Pennsylvania to a boy of 8, or that it had traveled 38 years and 1,000 miles to arrive in this cabin at this moment. He only knew that the heavy piece was warm and the thin piece was not, and that the difference mattered. Asa refused to sell any of the knowledge. He gave it freely, which confused Calvin Rusk more than anything else Asa had done. Calvin understood transactions. Generosity from a man he had mocked was something outside his accounting. Merritt Vale came on the 5th of January with a notebook and a measuring string. He did not knock. He walked in, sat down beside the stove, and opened the notebook to a blank page. "I want to build a version that doesn't use molten lead," he said. "Something a man with a wooden floor and a standard stove can use without burning down his house." "Stone wall and iron box," Asa said. "Tullough and I talked about it." "Show me." Asa described it. Flat stones stacked behind the stove, tight enough that no air gap broke the mass. An iron box, made from scrap plate or a cut-down stove body, filled with iron billets, nails, chain, whatever dense metal a man could find that did not need melting. Set the box beside the stove, where the radiant heat would warm it during the burn hours. After the fire died, the stone and iron would release heat slowly, extending the warm period by several hours. Merritt measured Asa's stone piers, sketched the stove frame, and asked questions that showed he had been thinking about the problem since the night he carried the ward boy through the snow. "What about sand?" Merritt asked. "Sand is heavy. Sand holds heat." "Not as well as iron. You'd need twice the box." "I can build twice the box. Sand is free." "Then build it. Build it wrong first. Check the temperature, then fix it." That's what I did. Merritt left with 3 pages of notes. Within 2 weeks, he had built a stone and iron heat wall behind his own stove. Mrs. Ward's nephew lined a stove alcove with flat stones and tamped earth. Scoville's revised iron box, nested in its stone cradle, gained 4 extra hours of warmth per night. A conventional cabin with 1 legal wood ration went cold before midnight. Asa's reinforced stove corner held usable warmth into the second day. The gap between methods was real, but the simpler versions were closing it. A stone and iron setup pushed a cabin from 6 hours to 10. 10 hours covered the worst of the night. The difference between 6 and 10 was the difference between waking in a frozen room and waking in a cold one, and cold was survivable, where frozen was not. Calvin Rusk watched the spread the way a man watches water rising toward his door. Calvin's business depended on scarcity. When men feared the cold, they paid his prices for emergency wood. When men learned to keep heat without extra fuel, the fear ebbed, and the prices followed. 3 families canceled standing orders with Calvin in the first week of January. By the second week, men who had once stood in line at his shed were building stone walls behind their stoves instead. Calvin tried a new attack. He went to Kershaw and argued that Asa's lead kettle constituted a public hazard, that the fumes were poison, that a cracked kettle would flood a cabin with molten metal, that the camp could not afford the fire risk. The argument was not entirely wrong. Lead was dangerous. The fumes were real. A crack in the kettle under full heat would be catastrophic. Tolliff was present when Calvin made his case outside Bladell's store. He sat on a stool and listened while Calvin listed the hazards with the fluency of a man who had rehearsed his objections. When Calvin finished, Tolliff spoke. "You are suddenly worried about safety," Tolliff said. "After locking Firewood in a shed while Mrs. Ward's daughter shook with cold and a boy collapsed in the snow trying to carry a heated stone to keep her alive." Calvin's face changed. The men listening shifted their weight. The silence had the quality of something that cannot be unsaid. "The lead is dangerous," Tolliff continued. "Asa knows it. I know it. That is why we teach stone and iron first, and lead only for reinforced cabins with earth floors. What is more dangerous than lead, Calvin, is a man who hoards the safe fuel and then complains about the dangerous alternative." Calvin left through the side door. He did not speak publicly about the kettle again for weeks. Through the rest of January, Tolliff and Asa worked together in the forge shed behind the assay office. The collaboration had shifted. In November, Tolliff had been the teacher and Asa the student. By January, they worked as partners, Asa bringing the practical problems of each cabin's layout, Tolliff providing the metalworker's knowledge of how heat moved through dense materials. They tested alternatives to the lead kettle. Soapstone blocks, heated on the forge coals and placed in a wooden box insulated with sawdust. Iron billets stacked in a stone cradle and fired until they glowed dull red. Sand-filled boxes sealed with iron lids and heated slowly through a full burn day. Stove benches, heavy plank seats packed with stone and iron beneath, designed to sit beside a stove and absorb heat all day, then warm a man through the evening. Each method had advantages and limits. Soapstone held heat well, but cracked. If heated too fast, Tolliff demonstrated this by firing a block hard and showing Asa the hairline fracture that ran through the center, invisible until he tapped it and the block fell in two pieces. Iron billets worked, but required more mass than stone for the same hours of warmth. Sand was the poorest heat holder, but the cheapest and the easiest for a man with no tools to manage. They kept notes on a board nailed to the forge wall, marking each material's performance with charcoal tally marks. The board looked like a schoolroom exercise, and Tolliff once said that it was exactly that, a school where the subject was patience and the examination was January. It was during this work that Tolliff told Asa about the foundries. They were waiting for a soapstone block to reach temperature. Tolliff sat on his stool and coughed into a rag, a long, rattling fit that left him pale and short of breath. When it passed, he spoke in the way men speak when they are not looking for a response but only for someone to hear. He had come to America from a village near Stavanger in 1852, 20 years old and strong enough to carry a 100-pound mold across a foundry floor without stopping. He had worked iron in Wisconsin, then steel in Illinois, then copper in Michigan. Each foundry left something in his lungs: smoke, metal dust, the fine particulate of sand molds that hung in the air like flour and settled deep in tissue that never fully cleared. In Michigan, he had carried ladles of molten copper from furnace to mold, and the heat rising from the pour singed his eyebrows until they stopped growing back. He had watched men his age die of lung ailment, one after another, their breathing growing shallower each year until they drowned in air that could not reach them. He left before it killed him, but he did not leave before it marked him. "I came to Colorado because the air's thin," Tolliff said. "Thin air and cold air. The doctors said it would help." Did it? For a time. Now I'm teaching a man to heat stone so he does not freeze, and the teaching costs me the same air I came here to save." Asa said nothing. There was nothing to say that would have been worth the breath. They clashed that week, and the clash mattered. Asa wanted to teach the full lead kettle method to Scovel, whose earth floor cabin and reinforced stove made him the best candidate in camp for a second kettle. Tolef refused. "The lead method is for you," Tolef said. "You built it. You understand the danger because you have felt it burn your arm. Scovel has not felt it. He has only seen the result. He can learn. He can learn to melt lead. He cannot learn in 1 week what you learned in 1 month about how the kettle breathes, how the seams glow, how the lid rings differently when the pressure changes underneath." Tolef held up his hand, the one that had slapped the burning sleeve off Asa's arm. "A man who melts lead without that knowledge kills someone, maybe himself, maybe the person sleeping beside his stove. If I don't teach it, someone will try it anyway. Better they learn from me than from guessing. Then teach them wrong and they die blaming you. Teach the stone method. Teach the iron method. Those are safe enough for a fool to build. The lead is not safe for anyone but the man who built it and the man who taught him." Asa relented. Not because Tolef was entirely right about Scovel. Scovel was careful, but because Tolef was right about the principle. The most dangerous thing about a successful innovation was the distance between watching it work and understanding how it could kill. He taught Scovel the improved iron box method instead. Scovel built it in 3 days and gained 4 extra hours per night. It was enough. Tolef's lungs worsened in February. The cold had not broken, and the forge work, heating metal, breathing smoke, moving tools through air that stung the throat, had compounded the damage that decades of foundry labor had begun. He coughed more than he spoke now. He slept sitting upright in the forge shed because lying flat closed his airways, and the walk back to his rented room left him too winded to manage the stairs. Asa saw it before Tolef acknowledged it. The Norwegian's hands shook in the moments between tasks, not during work, when concentration steadied them, but in the pauses, when his body delivered reports his will refused to accept. His lips carried a faint blue tinge on cold mornings that did not disappear when the forge warmed. His weight had dropped enough that the coat he wore hung from his shoulders like a drape over a frame. "You should stay inside," Asa said one morning when Tolef arrived with his face the color of ash. "Inside is where men go to wait," Tolef said. "I'm not waiting yet." He worked 3 more days. On the 3rd day, he sat on his stool and could not rise from it without putting both hands on his knees and pushing. He sat for a long time, breathing in the slow, deliberate way of a man who is measuring each breath against the number remaining. Then he took the file from his leather roll. The old one. The one with the notches cut along the spine for testing soft metal, its handle shaped by 40 years of his grip into a curve no other hand would fit comfortably. "First notch is lead," Tolef said, running his thumb along the spine. "Second is pewter. Third is tin. If the file slides past the 3rd notch without biting, the metal is too hard for the kettle. Discard it." "Why are you giving me this?" "Because my hands cannot use it, and a tool that sits unused has died already." Tolef did not come to the forge the next morning. Asa waited until noon, then walked to the shed behind the assay office where Tolef kept a cot near the chimney wall. He found Tolef wrapped in blankets with his coat folded under his head. The cot sat against the forged chimney bricks, which held warmth from the morning's fire the way stone holds warmth, slowly, patiently, without flame. Tolef had placed himself beside the only thermal mass available to him. Even dying, the instinct held. He was conscious. His breathing was shallow and rapid, the sound of lungs that had run out of room for the air they needed. His eyes were clear, and he looked at Asa without surprise, as though he had known who would come and when. Asa sat down on the floor beside the cot. He did not offer hope or medicine or reassurance because Tolef would have rejected all three. He offered what Tolef would accept: presence, silence, and the knowledge that the man beside him understood what was happening and would not pretend otherwise. Snow tapped the roof in light, intermittent bursts. The forge was cold. The bricks behind Tolef's cot still radiated the morning's warmth into the narrow space between the wall and the blankets. Tolef died near midnight. His breathing slowed, steadied, and stopped, and the quiet that followed was not the silence of an empty room, but the silence of a room that had lost the presence that filled it. The forge was cold that morning, but the file in Asa's hand still held the warmth of Tolef's palm. For once, Asa did not try to save the heat. He let it leave slowly. Asa buried Tolef on the slope above the Merriman Adit, where the ground was soft enough to dig if a man worked through the frozen crust with a pick and patience. Tom helped. Merritt carried the tools. Nell came despite her cough and stood at a distance because the climb had winded her. No one from the committee came. Tolef had lived in Saints' Rest for 2 years without joining anything or attending anything. He had given his knowledge to a man he respected and died beside the heat he understood, and the camp below did not mark his passing because the camp had never fully known he was there. Asa set the file on a stone beside the turned earth and stood for a long time, looking down the slope toward the cabins where smoke rose from stovepipes, and men he had taught were building heat walls from stones Tolef had shown him how to choose. The wind carried the smell of wood smoke up the slope, and for a moment the forge and the mountain and the camp below felt like a single continuous thing, heat rising from below, cold pressing from above, and the dead man between them who had understood both. Then Asa picked up the file, put it in his coat pocket, and walked back down to the work that remained. The camp did not know it had lost anything. Asa would make sure it did not need to. The secondary crisis came in March, when the spring thaw sent meltwater down the gulch in a rush that broke the footbridge and trapped 3 families on the far side of the creek during a wet, cold snap. The temperature was not extreme, 15 below, dropping toward 20, but the families on the far side had no way to reach the fuel station, and their cabins were among the poorest in camp. The creek ran too fast and deep to wade. The nearest crossing was 2 miles uphill through snow that was thigh-deep and softening into slush that soaked a man to the waist. Asa heard the news from Tom, who had been at the fuel station when a boy crossed the creek on a fallen log and arrived shaking, with his legs wet to the knee and his lips white. Asa could not move the kettle. He could not carry 1,000 pounds of lead across a broken bridge. But he could carry what Tolef had taught him, and that weighed nothing. He went to the assay office on the near side of the creek, a stone building with a heavy iron stove that the company had abandoned when the Merriman vein failed. The stove was sound. The walls were stone, and the creek bank was close enough to shout across. Asa sent Merritt and Tom to gather flat stones from the slope. He collected iron scrap from the forge shed, billets, chain, broken hinges, the head of a splitting maul, anything dense. He built a heat wall behind the assay office stove in 4 hours, working faster than he had ever worked because there was no one beside him to say slow down or check the stone with a tap. The difference registered in his hands before his mind caught it. He was selecting stones the way Tolef selected them, by sound, by weight, by the ring of a hammer tap that told him whether the stone was solid through or hiding a crack that would split under heat. He was shimming the base with iron shims cut from a hinge plate, the same technique Tolef had used on the cabin stove piers. He was building by feel, by pattern, by the memory stored in his muscles from weeks of working beside a man who taught through action and let the hands learn what the ears could not. Tolef was not there, but the file was in Asa's coat pocket, and the notches were in the right places, and the knowledge was in his hands where it belonged. He fired the assay office stove with wood merit hauled from the fuel station on emergency credit that Kershaw authorized without argument. The stone wall heated, the iron scrap heated. By evening, the office was warm enough to shelter families. They crossed one at a time on the fallen log, men first, then women carrying children, then the oldest, while Merritt stood in the creek up to his waist, holding a rope strung between two trees, his teeth clenched against water so cold it burned. No molten lead, no kettle, just stone, iron, fire, and the principle Tolef had spent his last months refining. Dense mass holds heat longer than thin air, and the man who understands that principle can build warmth from whatever the ground provides. The family slept in the assay office for 2 nights while men repaired the footbridge. The first night tested the method in real time. Asa stayed in the building, tending the fire through the afternoon, watching the stone wall darken as it absorbed heat, checking the iron scrap with the back of his hand. By sunset, the wall radiated enough warmth that a man standing 2 feet away could feel it through his coat. He let the fire die at 8 o'clock and sat down to wait. At midnight, the stone wall was still warm. The iron scrap, nested in its cradle, threw heat upward against the ceiling and outward against the nearest sleepers. A child whimpered in a dream and rolled closer to the wall without waking. The building smelled of wood smoke, damp wool, and the mineral breath of heated stone. At 4 in the morning, 8 hours after the fire died, Asa pressed his palm against the stone. Cool now, but not cold. The iron still held usable warmth. The room was above freezing by a margin thin enough that a broken window would erase it. But no windows were broken, and the door was sealed, and the families were alive. Not the 36 hours of the lead kettle, but enough. The children slept. The adults endured. Nobody froze. If this story reminds you why preparation matters more than pride, share it with someone who would understand Asa's kind of stubbornness. Calvin Rusk watched the rescue from the near side of the creek. He did not help. He did not hinder. He stood with his arms crossed and watched Asa direct men to build heat walls in a stone building using techniques that Calvin had once called the work of a man who had lost his mind. 3 more families canceled their standing wood orders that week. Calvin's contracts had shrunk by more than half. The emergency committee, under Kershaw's revised guidance, had begun inspecting cabin quality and recommending thermal improvements before winter rather than rationing fuel during it. The order itself was not repealed. Kershaw was too careful for that, but its enforcement had shifted from punishment to prevention, and the shift had Asa's fingerprints on every page. Calvin's influence was fading the way a fire fades when the fuel is spent. And the man who had replaced it, without seeking the replacement, without planning it, without wanting anything more than to keep his own cabin alive, was the man Calvin had once promised to sell by the pound after he froze. Asa did not celebrate. He returned to his cabin, hung the file on a nail beside the stove where Tolef's stool had once stood, and began planning for next winter, because next winter was always coming, and the lesson Tolef had left behind was not about lead or stone or iron. It was about paying attention to what held heat and what surrendered it, and understanding that the difference between the two was the difference between living and waiting to die. The camp was changing. The question was whether Asa could teach the principle faster than desperation could twist it. Spring came to Saints' Rest the way spring comes to high country, not as warmth, but as a slow retreat of cold, a grudging concession the mountains made to the calendar, while the wind continued to argue. The snow pulled back from the south-facing slopes first, revealing mud and rock and the scars of a winter that had tested every cabin in the gulch. 3 remained abandoned. Horrocks was the most visible, its door hanging open and its stove cold, a monument to the gap between a fair rule and a survivable one. Asa spent April repairing his south wall. He tore out the old chinking, replaced the worst planks with timber merit cut from deadfall above the Merriman adit, and packed every gap with a mixture of mud, straw, and lime that Tolliff had once described as the only insulation a poor man could make for free. By May, the cabin had 4 solid walls for the first time since Asa had moved in. The cracked windows had been replaced with salvaged glass from the boarding house. The door hung plumb. The stove sat on its stone piers like a thing that intended to stay. The kettle remained. 1,000 pounds of lead and pewter, scarred and blackened, with a cracked handle and a warped lid that no longer sat perfectly flush. It was ugly. It smelled of metal and ash, and it had kept 6 people alive when the law, the weather, and the community had all agreed they should freeze. Through the summer of 1881, Asa developed the 3-tier system that Tolliff had helped him begin. He wrote nothing down. Asa was not a writing man, but he carried the specifications in his head with the precision of a carpenter who measures once because he cannot afford the wood to measure twice. The first tier was the stone heat wall, flat stone stacked tight behind the stove, floor to ceiling if possible, with no air gaps wider than a knife blade. Cost, nothing but labor. Any cabin could have one. Performance, 3 to 4 extra hours of warmth after the fire died. Asa demonstrated the principle at a Saturday gathering behind Blaydell's store by heating 2 stones on a fire pit, one stacked tight against an iron plate, one sitting alone, and letting men feel the difference after the fire was raked out. The stacked stone held warmth an hour longer. The men understood without Asa saying another word. By August, more than 20 cabins had stone heat walls. The second tier was the iron belly box. Scrap iron, billets, chain, hinges, horseshoes, anything dense, packed into a sealed iron container and set beside the stove inside a stone cradle. The cradle insulated the box from below and reflected heat upward and inward, keeping the warmth concentrated instead of bleeding it into the floor. Cost, the price of scrap iron, which in a mining camp was nearly nothing. A man could fill a box with discarded horseshoes and broken drill steel for the price of hauling it. Performance, 4 to 6 extra hours. Merritt built the first one using a technique he and Asa worked out together. The box nested in a U-shaped stone cradle with a flat stone cap that doubled as a warming shelf for drying socks and gloves. The design was simple enough that Merritt could teach it to another man in an afternoon, and he became the person others sought when they wanted their own. The third tier was the lead kettle. Asa recommended it for no one. He told every man who asked that the lead method required an earth floor, a reinforced stove, professional knowledge of metal behavior, and a tolerance for danger that most people should not test. He described the wet scrap explosion that had burned his arm. He showed them the scar. He told them about the fumes, the slow poison that Tolliff had warned him about, the wet rag over the face, the need to vent the room even when venting meant losing heat. He did not romanticize the kettle. He presented it as what it was, a desperate measure born from a desperate winter, effective and dangerous in equal proportion. Build the wall, Asa told them. Build the box. If that is not enough, come back and we will talk about the kettle. But you will not build a kettle until I have seen your cabin, checked your floor, and watched you handle hot metal without flinching. No one built a second kettle that year. The walls and boxes were enough. Nell Rusk had been organizing before Asa noticed. While he worked on heat walls and iron boxes, Nell had been walking the camp with a purpose that looked like neighborliness, but operated like an inspection. She visited women in their cabins and drank their coffee and listened to their complaints about drafts. And while she listened, she looked. She checked where children slept, against exterior walls, where the cold crept through, or against interior walls where the warmth held. She checked stove conditions, cracked plates, missing dampers, pipes that leaked smoke into the room instead of carrying it out. She checked floors, bare planks over open crawl spaces, or packed earth that held the cold at bay. She reported what she found to Asa each evening, not as gossip, but as intelligence. The Ingalls cabin had a floor gap wide enough to slide a hand through. The Scoville stove was missing 2 bolts on the firebox door. Mrs. Ward's replacement stovepipe, installed after the storm, was already rusting at the joint where rain dripped from the roof. "You're doing the committee's work," Asa said one evening. "The committee counts wood. I'm counting the places the wood can't reach." It was the first time Asa understood that Nell saw the same problem he did, but from a different angle. He saw heat and mass, and the physics of retention. She saw families and children, and the human architecture of who slept where and why. Between the two perspectives, the camp's weaknesses became visible in a way neither could have achieved alone. Their courtship, if that word applied to 2 people who had been sharing labor and proximity for months without naming it, developed through the work itself. They argued over which cabins needed help first. Nell said the families with children. Asa said the cabins with the worst construction. They were both right, and the argument became a method. Address the most dangerous cabins first, prioritize children's sleeping positions second, and work outward from there. They carried stones together. They measured walls. Nell boiled coffee for work crews that Asa organized on Saturday mornings, when men who had spent the week in the mines were willing to spend a few hours stacking stone for a neighbor if someone fed them and told them where to put it. Asa added a second room to his cabin in September. He built it himself, with Merritt's help on the framing and Tom's help carrying lumber. The room was 8 by 10 feet, small but tight, with solid chinking and a shared wall with the main cabin that let heat from the kettle reach both rooms. He did not announce the purpose of the addition. He did not need to. Nell and Tom moved in before the first frost. The town register recorded the arrangement in October, a single line in Kershaw's hand that noted the marriage of Osa Varden and Nell Rusk without ceremony or comment. Kershaw had written laws that nearly killed them both. The least he could do was record the line that joined them. Tom kept his cot in the new room and his duties unchanged. He split kindling. He carried scrap. He tested metal with Tollef's file, running his thumb along the notches the way Asa had taught him, learning by feel which metals were worth heating and which would crack inside a melt. The next winter arrived on time and without the freight disasters of the previous year. Wood wagons ran on schedule. The emergency committee, chastened by Harwick's death and Kershaw's revised approach, inspected cabins before the first snow rather than rationing fuel after it. They measured wall thickness, checked stove condition, noted which cabins had heat walls and which did not. The inspections were not mandatory, but men who refused them found that their fuel rations were calculated with less generosity, which was Kershaw's quiet way of applying pressure without writing another rule that might kill someone. Asa walked the inspections with the committee that first year. He did not carry a title or a ledger. He carried Tollef's file in his coat pocket and a habit of pressing his hand against walls to feel where the cold came through. At each cabin, he asked the same questions. Where does your draft come from? Where do your children sleep? How many hours does your stove hold heat after the last stick burns? The answers told him what the cabin needed, and the recommendations he made, stone here, iron there, chinking on that wall, move the child's bed to the interior side, became the committee's standard practice for the next 3 years. By the winter of 1882, more than 30 cabins in Saints Rest had stone heat walls. 12 had iron belly boxes. 3 had stove benches, Merritt's design, a heavy plank seat packed with stone and iron that sat beside the stove and absorbed heat all day, then warmed a man through the evening while he sat on it. One miner said it was the first time he had been warm from the bottom up since leaving Missouri. Asa's remained the only lead kettle, sitting on its stone piers like a black monument to the winter that had nearly ended everything. The camp's relationship with cold had changed in ways that were visible to anyone who looked. Woodpiles were smaller, not because men had less wood, but because they needed less. Stovepipes ran straighter and tighter, because the committee inspectors flagged the ones that leaked. Children slept against interior walls because Nell's teams had moved every child's bed they could reach away from the exterior cold. And in the evenings, when the fire burned low and the temperature dropped, men sat beside their heat walls and iron boxes and felt the warmth coming back from the stone. And they did not panic because they understood that the heat was not gone. It was stored. It was waiting. It would last. Merritt Vale became the man who checked cabin floors before winter. He crawled under buildings with a lantern and a pry bar, testing joists for rot, sounding them with a hammer the way Tollef had taught Asa to sound stones, and telling homeowners what weight their floors could bear before any heavy thermal mass was added. He had built a reputation for thoroughness that bordered on stubbornness. He once refused to approve a heat wall installation until the homeowner replaced two joists that Merritt judged punky at the center, even though the homeowner insisted they were sound. Merritt pulled one out and broke it over his knee. The homeowner replaced both joists without further argument. He had started as the man who thought weight just sat there. He ended as the man who understood that weight was the entire point, and that the floor beneath it was the foundation that made everything above it possible. Scavenged, the miner with the iron ammunition box, built heat walls for 3 neighbors and taught 2 others to build their own. He charged nothing. He worked on Saturdays, the way Asa worked, and he told men who thanked him to thank the Norwegian who had died behind the forge shed, because the knowledge had started there. The thanks traveled through the camp like heat through stone, slowly, indirectly, but arriving where it needed to go. Mrs. Ward's nephew, the 17-year-old who had lined her stove alcove with stone during the crisis winter, became an apprentice to a bricklayer in Leadville. He built masonry stove surrounds that held heat for 10 hours and more, thick walls of brick and mortar that absorbed a day's fire and released it through the night with a patience that matched the stone itself. He told customers that the idea had come from a man in Saints Rest who melted lead in a sugar kettle during a fuel panic. The story grew with each telling. The kettle got larger. The cold got deeper. The number of people saved increased, which meant it was becoming folklore, which meant the principle was surviving even as the specific facts drifted into legend. Calvin Rusk's shed burned in the first week of January, 1882. The irony was not lost on anyone who witnessed it. Calvin had built that shed with better lumber and tighter joints than most cabins in the gulch. He had padlocked the door with hardware he bought in Leadville. He had stacked his wood inside with the care of a man arranging currency in a vault, split pine in measured cords, kindling bound in rope bundles, each row raised on pallets to keep the moisture off. The shed was his inventory, his leverage, and his insurance against the winters that made other men desperate enough to pay his prices. A lantern tipped. The accident was small. A gust through a wall crack, a flame touching straw packing, a lick of fire catching the edge of a dry pine split. By the time Calvin reached the shed door, the south wall was fully involved. The heat pushed him back 20 feet. He could hear the wood popping inside, the sound of his entire stock cracking and splintering in the blaze, every cord he had priced and leveraged through 2 winters turning to carbon in minutes. He saved nothing. The shed collapsed in 90 minutes into a heap of orange coals that hissed against the snow and sent smoke across the gulch so thick it stung eyes a quarter-mile away. Men came out of their cabins to watch. No one helped. No one was asked to. Calvin's wife, Ada, and his younger sister, Ruth, were in their cabin when the shed went. The cabin itself was not damaged, but Calvin's stove was old and poorly maintained. He had spent his money on the shed, not the house. and his walls were no better than average. Without the woodshed, he had nothing but the legal ration to heat his home. The same ration he had once supplemented with his own hoarded supply while selling emergency bundles to neighbors at 3 times the fair price. The cold that week was not extreme by Saints' Rest standards. 15 below and falling, which was survivable for a tight cabin with a good stove. Calvin's cabin was neither tight nor good. His stove leaked at the firebox door. His east wall had chinking gaps he had never bothered to fill because he had always had enough wood to overpower the drafts. He came to Asa's cabin after midnight. The walk from his place to Asa's was 400 yards uphill, and the cold that night was 15 below and falling. Calvin arrived with snow on his shoulders and his face set in the expression of a man who was performing the most difficult act of his life. He did not knock gently. He pounded the door with the flat of his hand, the way a man knocks when he's angry at the door for existing between himself and what he needs. Asa opened it. Nell stood behind him with a lamp. Calvin looked at Asa. His jaw worked once, like a man chewing on a sentence he could not swallow and could not spit out. "Tell me what to do," Calvin said. The words came out flat and hard, stripped of courtesy, stripped of humility, stripped of everything except the raw minimum required to ask for help from a man he had mocked, reported, and tried to ruin. He did not apologize. He did not acknowledge what he had done. He asked for information the way a man asks for water when his house is on fire, because the alternative is worse than the asking. Asa stood in the doorway and felt the cold coming through, and looked at Calvin Rusk, who had told men at Blaisdell's store that he would sell the kettle by the pound after Asa froze. He felt the weight of every night he had hauled scrap on a sled while Calvin's men watched from the trail, every inspection Calvin had demanded, every rumor Calvin had spread. He almost said no. Nell stepped beside him. She put her hand on his arm, not pulling, not pushing, just resting it there with the specific pressure of a woman who knew exactly what her husband was thinking and wanted him to think one step further. "Tell him enough to keep them alive," Nell said. Asa looked at her. Then he looked at Calvin. "Merritt," Asa said. "Get Merritt. Tell him to bring iron plates, the flat stones from behind his cabin, and the long pry bar. I'll tell him what to build when he gets to your place." Calvin did not say thank you. He turned and walked back down the hill through the snow, and Asa watched him go with an expression that was not satisfaction and not forgiveness, but something closer to exhaustion, the tiredness of a man who has spent a year fighting a battle he never wanted and has now been asked to arm the other side. Merritt arrived at Calvin's cabin within the hour, under Asa's instructions relayed through Tom, who ran between the cabins in the dark. Merritt built a stone and iron heat wall behind Calvin's stove in 3 hours. He used the flat stones he had carried from the slope, the iron plates he had stockpiled for exactly this kind of emergency, and the same technique Asa had used in the assay office during the thaw crisis. Calvin's family survived the night. The heat wall gave them 5 extra hours. Ada and Ruth slept near the stove corner, while Calvin sat awake in a chair, watching the stones radiate heat he had not earned and could not have built himself. Calvin did not become warm-hearted after that night. He did not seek Asa out to express gratitude or admiration. He did not join the Saturday work crews or offer scrap iron or carry stones. What he became was quiet. He stopped telling stories at Blaisdell's store. He stopped spreading rumors. He stopped trying to convince the committee that Asa was a danger to the camp. His opposition did not transform into support. It simply ended, the way a fire ends when the fuel is gone and no one feeds it. It was the most honest conversion in Saints' Rest. Not a change of heart, but a change of silence. The years compressed the way years do when the crisis that defined them passes and the work that follows becomes routine. Asa and Nell kept the household ledger together, she tracking the families who needed help, he tracking the materials available and the methods that fit each cabin. They argued at the kitchen table over coffee that was never strong enough for Asa and never weak enough for Nell, and the arguments were the kind that builds something rather than destroy it. Tom Russ grew into the work the way a tree grows into the shape of the wind that pushes it. He apprenticed first with the assayer in Leadville, learning the chemistry of metals that Tollef had known by feel and by sound. He learned that the dull thud of clean lead had a name, that the heat Tollef measured by holding his palm at arm's length could be measured by instruments that reported numbers instead of sensations. But the instruments, Tom found, were no faster than Tollef's hand had been. The old Norwegian had been his own thermometer, calibrated by decades of standing beside hot metal, and the numbers only confirmed what his body had already known. Tom returned to Saints Rest and became the man who fitted stoves, checking plates for cracks that leaked heat into walls instead of rooms, testing flue draw by holding a lit match at the damper and watching the angle of the flame, measuring firebox volume against cabin size to determine whether a stove could heat the space it served. He marked stove surfaces with notched lines the way Tollef had once marked the file, a private language of measurement that other stove fitters eventually copied without knowing its origin. He carried the file in his coat pocket. When asked about the notches, he told the story of the Norwegian who had tested soft metal by sound and taught a stubborn trapper to listen. Nell organized the Women's Inspection Network into something the committee eventually adopted as official practice. Before each winter, teams walked the camp and identified the weakest cabins, the ones with thin walls, cracked stoves, exposed floors, and children sleeping against exterior walls where the cold crept through pine boards and frost formed on the inside surface of the wood. Nell had learned to read a cabin's weaknesses the way Asa read a stove, by putting her hand where the cold came through and following it to its source. A draft at ankle height meant the floor was leaking. A frost pattern on an interior wall meant the chinking had failed on the other side. A child with a cough that would not clear meant the sleeping position was wrong, the stove was venting poorly, or both. The committee funded repairs from a community pool that Kershaw established using fees collected from the mining companies. The companies paid because Kershaw convinced them that dead miners' families made for bad business and worse publicity, and because the cost of the fund was less than the cost of the lawsuits and departures that followed every winter death. By 1883, Saints Rest had a winter committee that measured not only wood, but heat loss, wall thickness, stove condition, floor insulation, shared warming rooms, thermal mass, and emergency fuel reserves. The committee met in October and published a list of cabins that needed work. Men who could afford repairs did them. Men who could not received help from the Saturday crews. The system was not perfect. It was not romantic. It was a town learning to count what actually mattered instead of what was easiest to count. Asa's lead kettle remained in his cabin through all of it, sitting on its stone piers with its cracked handle and its blackened walls and its warped lid that Tom had learned to seat just so. Asa heated it less often as the winters grew milder and the cabin grew tighter. Some years it sat cold for weeks, a dense gray monument in the corner that visitors asked about, and that Nell complained about when she swept around it. But Asa never moved it, and Nell never truly asked him to. They both understood that some things stayed not because they were useful, but because they were proof. Kershaw stepped down from the emergency committee in 1884. He was 66, slower than he had been, and tired in the specific way of a man who has spent 4 years rewriting rules he once thought were final. He left behind a ledger that recorded every inspection, every repair, every cabin improvement the committee had overseen. On the last page, in his careful hand, he had underlined a single sentence: "A fair law must be tested in the poorest room." Merritt Vale married the Ingalls woman in the spring of that year. He built her a cabin with a stone heat wall, so thick it took 2 men to carry each layer of rock, and he checked the floor joists himself before laying the first board. Their first child was born in a cabin that held warmth for 12 hours after the fire died, which meant the baby slept through the coldest nights without waking, which meant the parents slept too, which was a form of luxury that no amount of money could have purchased, and that only preparation could provide. Asa grew older. His shoulders stiffened further until he could no longer raise his left arm above his head, and the morning routine of dressing required a patience he had never needed when his body worked without negotiation. His hands, scarred from rope burns and lead spatters and the ordinary damage of decades of hard use, lost their dexterity for fine work. He stopped hauling scrap and started advising, sitting in his cabin while men described their problems and he described the solutions, using his hands to draw shapes in the air that Tom would later translate into measurements and materials lists. He taught by asking questions now, the way Tolef had taught him, not by lecturing, but by leading a man's thinking toward the answer the man could not yet see. When a miner asked why his iron box cooled so fast, Asa would ask where the box sat. On a wooden shelf, the miner would say. And Asa would ask what the shelf was made of and what sat beneath it, and whether the box touched the stone wall behind the stove. And eventually the miner would understand on his own that the box was radiating heat downward through the shelf and outward through the air instead of holding it, and that the fix was stone beneath and stone beside, the same answer it always was. Nell teased him that he had become an old man who answered questions with questions. Asa said that was because the answers only stuck when a man found them himself. He still woke before dawn, on cold mornings. He still checked the stove by habit, pressing his palm against the kettle lid to feel whether the metal held warmth from the night's fire. The gesture was unnecessary now. The cabin was tight. The walls were thick, and the stove held heat well enough that the kettle was more monument than machine. But the habit remained, the way a man's hand goes to his belt to check for a tool he no longer carries. Some mornings, when the air was still and the light came blue through the window glass, Asa stood beside the kettle and remembered the night 6 people had slept in this room with no fire and no wood, and nothing between them and the cold except 1,000 pounds of scrap metal that a dead Norwegian had taught him to heat. Fights. Within 3 winters of the crisis, more than 30 cabins around Saints Rest used some form of heat retention method. Stone walls, iron plates, stove benches, reinforced thermal masses. Only Asa's cabin kept the original lead kettle. Most households chose safer versions, and the methods branched and adapted the way practical knowledge does when it passes through enough hands. A miner in California Gulch built a stone bench that doubled as a bed frame. A teamster on the pass packed his wagon box with heated iron for overnight camps. A woman in Leadville lined her nursery wall with brick and heated it from the kitchen stove on the other side. None of them had met Asa Varden. All of them were using the principle he had proven in a 12-by-16 cabin with a cracked kettle and a dead man's file. Asa Varden lived out his later years near the same gulch where the elders had once tried to limit survival by counting sticks of wood. Nell kept the household ledger until her hand shook too much to write, and then Tom kept it for her. The cabin grew a 3rd room, then a porch, then a woodshed that Asa built larger than any man needed, not because he feared running out, but because he remembered what it felt like when someone told him he could not have enough. He died in the winter of 1893, in his bed beside the stove, with the kettle cold and the cabin warm. On a night in late December of 1880, the thermometer outside Bladell's store dropped past 30 below, and a man named Calvin Rusk stood in that store and told the men around him, "Varden's cooking rocks now. Let him. When he freezes, I'll sell the kettle by the pound." The kettle did not freeze. The man who built it did not freeze. The 6 people he sheltered did not freeze. And Calvin Rusk, who had laughed longest, became the quietest man in Saints Rest after the night he pounded on Asa Varden's door and asked to be saved by the thing he had mocked. Years later, a child visiting the cabin pointed at the kettle, black, cold, silent, taking up space in a clean room, and asked why anyone would keep such an ugly thing. Asa, old now, rested his hand above the lid without touching it. He held it there the way his father had once held a boy's hand above a cooling wagon hub in a Pennsylvania forge. He did not explain all of it. He only said, because once when the fire was gone, it still remembered.